Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. We got another weekly round of PvP updates, PvP analysis. We're going to be looking at the results of the changes that happened last week and what has been going on in the game in terms of power and potency of every specialization. Given that there weren't actually any changes this week, I wanted to see if there was an identifiable or measurable difference in terms of meta and which specializations we're starting to see more of and which ones are starting to potentially shine stronger. So we can see which patches were tracked here on the Drustvar website with the 11.0.5 patch dramatically dropping down Shadow Priest's participation almost immediately. And then with the tuning towards the Void Weaver hero talent tree, the Shadow Priest actually has descended even further in overall participation. But as I participated in Flarkness's community tournament, Shadow Priest was probably one of the most, if not the most dominant specialization in the entire tournament. And Shadow Priest is likely still going to remain quite a formidable force at a high competitive level. So I don't know if this is just perception of Shadow Priest, seeing it get nerfed, and maybe it's just that it's easier at the moment because we see, you know, with the trajectory of Shadow Priest, BM Hunter continued to rise. It fell initially with some of the nerfs that we expected to see for Beast Mastery, but it has almost immediately recovered. So Beast Mastery is basically back to where it was even prior to the nerfs as far as participation. So perhaps that's what this is that this is just a group of players that follows the trend on like what's the absolute most powerful thing that they can play, and they switched from Shadow Priest to Beast Mastery Hunter, and there weren't actually just this many Shadow Priests in general playing the game, because it's still my expectation that Shadow Priest is one of the strongest, if not the strongest ranged. Maybe Elemental Shaman is closing in on it overall. But we also see a very big spike in Arms Warrior with the buffs towards Mortal Strike. Mortal Strike's now hitting like upwards of 2 million plus damage. Demolish can hit very hard, although I think some of the most competitive warriors are still sticking to Slayer. And it's obvious that this has had very big implications on the ladder. I think that especially at like the lower to mid-level ratings for Arms Warrior, now with the type of burst that you can bring, you're a lot more compatible in that range. But at higher range where you start getting kited and you start getting these caster lobbies and you're not able to connect as much and people know how to trade their cooldowns more effectively, you fall off. So to me, Arms Warrior is kind of like a low-rated bully spec. So if you're looking for something that can just like pound out at low ratings, Arms Warrior is probably going to be really good down there. Ret Paladin's had an interesting roller coaster of ups and downs and ups, and seems to be holding steady at a decent margin still, within the top 3 represented specs since those changes 2 weeks ago. So I think like the hammer of light damage that you're able to do on a Ret Paladin is definitely very high. Still doesn't seem like, I don't know if it's going to be overtaken as like the most powerful spec in the game by any means, but it's definitely a lot healthier than it was specifically. And that seems to be kind of the trend for some of the most represented specs. Frost Mage is still holding strong, even though, despite its descent from 11.0.5, given that Hunters and Ellies went out of control with that patch, especially with the bugs, it kind of just forced all the Frost Mages into hiding. But it seems like they're still holding strong and recovering since those changes that came through. And then all the other specs are kind of competing, in this like mid-ground field. And I think we can see kind of the win rates more specifically for them. So Beast Mastery Hunters, since the changes, the win rates have fallen about 3% to 54%, but you're still above 50% win rate, which is really good at the moment. You're holding a 12% representation rate. I think, being strong and an easy to play class is likely going to lead to, high participation, high representation, and high win rates. Arms Warrior win rate has also gone down a little bit. I think this is likely as players figure out how your cooldowns work and how to trade with Demolish and how to trade with Warbreaker more efficiently. Win rates will probably go down. You'll start to struggle, but your representation is definitely going up, and I had a lot of fun on it. I think that's the most important factor, right, for the game. When we're talking tournament level, players basically want specs to be as invincible as possible. And that's going to be the most tournament viable compositions, are the specs that are the tankiest. I can pull open any VOD from a BlizzCon championship, and there's a 99.9% chance that the composition that ended up winning BlizzCon was comprised of 3 of the most difficult specs to kill, if they weren't already borderline immortal, basically, relative to everything else. And Arms Warrior is just not in that camp. So they could buff Ignore Pain, they could buff Second Wind, they could make it invincible. I don't think that's healthy for the game. I think it's still better to look at the survivability of the specs that are being really represented at that level, and maybe potentially look at bringing those down, because the game is not healthy when everything in the game can't die. We've already been there, and that's why this debate of like buff the weak versus nerf the strong, it doesn't always work with buff the weak, and it doesn't always work with nerf the strong. In this instance, I think it's you got to look at the survivability of the strongest specs like they did with Feral Druid and Shadow Priest in the recent tuning that they did. Red Paladin win rate actually has gone up a little bit. A little bit of a shaky path, but still above 50% win rate. 8% representation is great. Demonology Warlock representation has gone up a bit, but win rate's gone down to 4.33%. Demo definitely feels a lot better since I've played with it. Demo's main problem is like pet AI, and that your pets are so easily controlled. So again, it's much like Arms Warrior at low ratings where people aren't aware of your pets and they're not CCing them. You're getting max uptime. You're going to be able to kind of pump out some big numbers, but as you get to higher ratings, enemies are going to start controlling your pets and making it really difficult for you to connect meaningful damage, which is why I think Affliction is likely still kind of like taking over as far as the main Warlock spec. I was honestly surprised Ellie Shaman's representation to be so low at 4.43%. Still holds solid at over 50% win rate. I feel like its damage is still remarkably high. As I just played mine, I finished my 2400 challenge on Beast Mastery Hunter and Balanced Druid, and I'm trying to do it now on Elemental Shaman. And Elemental Shaman felt really good, but it seems like it's kind of just falling into the mid tier as far as like overall representation. But Elemental is like a specialization that I feel like I could see at like a tournament level, mostly due to its survivability. It's got talent that reduce damage on itself when it has an elemental out, and you can get a lot of elementals out. You can cast Stormkeeper and summon out this little storm elemental that gives you 5% damage reduction, your earth elemental, your fire elemental. You have a bunch of ways to get the extra 5% damage reduction. You have just a passive 6% magic damage reduction. You have wind shear talents that give you 15 up to 30% damage reduction when you land it on casters, and you have the options to go into healing stream totem damage reduction as well, I think for another additional 6% on some magic types. And these types of damage reduction modifiers stacked together are what are very good at like a tournament level of play. Lower level rating, maybe not so much, but I still even think at lower level rating, Elemental Shaman can be good. So I was honestly surprised with this. I wonder if this is like a perception thing with Elemental Shaman, given how initially heavy-handed the nerfs were looking for them. Because we can see the spike right from here, and then it just fell down after that. But its win rate's actually gone up since then, and I feel like it's still looking really good. Now, Balanced Druid win rate has actually gone up as well. And representation a little bit as well, up to 2.26%. I think the lethality for Boomkin is very high. Again, much like Arms Warrior, it's a really good low mid-range rating bully spec where you can pop your cooldowns and people don't know how to react to them or don't know what they are. You will just kill somebody really fast in those types of exchanges. So I think at that rating threshold, it's really strong. As you get to higher level ratings, I think the vulnerabilities in its defense, similar to Arms Warrior, start to become a lot more apparent as enemies make more efficient and effective trades with your cooldowns, which is why we see like this debate in comment sections for these specializations, like Boomkin is really, it's the best spec in the game, and then other people are like, no, Boomkin is trash, it just dies, it falls over. And that's the main reason, is because you're getting perspectives from low rated players, and at low rating it's really powerful and strong, and then at high rating it's going to feel weaker and weaker as you go, especially given that the representation of the specs at higher rating changes to more kind of like bleed high mobility specs, which are really good into Balanced Druid. But it's definitely healthier than it was given the changes. Do I see it like winning a tournament? I think Sam I Am is maybe the only player, and Corky and EU are the only players really that I've seen, spending a lot of time on it. When I watch the streams, doesn't look like particularly powerful against some of the most meta options at the highest level of 3v3. But definitely in Shuffle, when the coordination is lower, you're going to see a lot more success. I think that's why we're seeing the win rate go up. For Balanced Druid specifically. Assassination, minor change on win rate, but I think Assassination is still honestly holding really strong. Rogue specializations typically have low representation, and they also have 3 DPS specs, right? So it's like you sometimes have to like lump those together in terms of their overall representation when you really want to consider that, because they're all the same role basically. But Assassination is still at a really healthy position. It seems still very strong. Even despite what has happened. So I would definitely say Assassination still looks good. Destruction, I initially thought that it was looking good, but I actually think it's not good. I've played in a tournament, and there was a Destro lock, and you cast like 5 Chaos Bolts in a row. It didn't really look like it did a lot. Seems like the damage is still not extremely lethal for Destruction specifically, and I don't expect like Destro to be like taking over Affliction or something like that, given the changes that's happened to it. So maybe it needs like another round of tune-up, a little bit of a damage bump for it specifically, but it's definitely not gone where I was really expecting it to go. Fury Warrior, win rate down a little bit, representation up. I think Fury Warrior did receive some buffs, much like Arms. I think it's probably at the higher level, it's more competitive than Arms, but at the low level rating, it's probably not, because the burst damage catches new players off guard as opposed to the sustained damage of Fury being more valuable, but same problem where you just get kited. And yeah, it's just mobility is the problem as you start to get higher and higher rating with this spec specifically. Demon Hunter, we didn't see any changes for it. We still haven't seen any changes for it. And it's still kind of holding that kind of a lower end in terms of representation. And I would say that it is identifiably weak in the current meta and could use like a minor increase to its damage. Basically almost on anything, just a little bit more of a throughput increase for it specifically. And I think it's likely going to be in a pretty decently competitive spot. Outlaw Rogue. Now, a lot of the tournament level players were saying that Outlaw Rogue, this is it. Like, this is the main spec that we're going to be going to. I saw Trill practicing Outlaw Rogue on his stream last night, but in Shuffle, its win rate has gone down 16%. 16%. So by all technical purposes, Outlaw has gotten worse with a drop off that hard. Although it was going from a 72% win rate. So the data here is probably limited to literally the best rogues in the game, because the 72% win rate is literally ridiculous. That's probably one of the highest win rates I've ever seen. So this is likely maybe more people re-rolling to it, thinking that it's strong and they're not as talented at it, so their win rate is lower, and that's bringing like the overall standard down for it specifically. I think Outlaw Rogue is still really good, so that's why I was surprised to see this. But again, it dropped 16, but it dropped to still one of the highest win rates at 56%. So I think it's still holding strong, although its representation is really low now. I don't know if that's just because people prefer to play Assassination, prefer Subtlety, given the fantasy and flavor. It feels more like a rogue. Outlaw kind of feels more like a warrior or a bruiser. So if you want to play a rogue, it doesn't really feel like you're playing a rogue with that spec specifically. But I think it's still, you can see the graph is still really steady. I think it's still in a solid spot. Frosty K, I feel like there's basically just only one person still playing Frosty K, and I don't think we even looked at Unholy DK. We're probably going to get that pretty soon. But Frosty K, it's just a rough spot because you're just this one-shot wombo combo one-trick spec. And they did earlier in the beta phase start giving you some changes to try and look at that and try and make you even out those spikes, but it ends up being, it's just the same. It's just Grip, Blinded Sleep, one shot, and then you're doing nothing. So I feel like they still have more work on that front in terms of trying to make you feel like you're more than just this one-trick wombo. Although the wombo is a cool like identifying factor, and a lot of classes have that type of setup, but having just non-existent pressure outside of it just makes it so that if you don't win in that window, you're probably not winning, and that's just it's just not going to be a competitive option, I think, in a lot of cases, because you're not going to get paired up with classes that work for that combo. You're going to fight compositions that might not be great for that combo, and it makes it kind of rough to succeed. Enhancement Shaman, I'm surprised to see this because it improved a lot. Enhancement is a lot better, but it dropped 1% win rate, a little bit increase in terms of overall representation, and I had an absolute blast when I played it. I'll link a video at the end of this with my gameplay on Arms Warrior and Enhancement. I was under geared on both of them with like green weapons and stuff. And it was still really fun. I had the most fun on it ever. So a bit surprised to not see this one trending in a different direction. Kind of makes me wonder if it just means that the players left playing at this point in the season are just all bottom sweat players that only are literally going to play what they think is the top 0.1%. We've kind of lost the body of average players at this point in the season because they've either got their elite set or MMR rating thresholds preventing them from climbing, caused them to quit. Like Battleground Blitz queues have gone up a lot. I don't know if it was honestly worth it, the changes that they made to trying to build different compositions for Battleground Blitz, because the queue times are so much longer, and then the amount of points that you get when you win, you can be a 1,000 rating MMR higher than your CR and only get 10 points when you win. That just seems ridiculous. So the Battleground Blitz rating distribution and reward structure needs to be looked at. The participation there is going to continue to fall if they don't. But I'm kind of wondering if maybe that, population leaving, maybe that's why Enhancement Shaman representation it's increased from where it was, but it's still lower than I would have anticipated given the rework that it's got. Subtlety Rogue has pretty much stayed exactly the same despite everybody saying the sky is falling that plays a rogue. I think it's still got a lot of potential in terms of its one shot, but damage outside of that definitely a little bit more lackluster. It's definitely like locked in on its kind of like shadowy dual smoke bomb one shot windows, as opposed to having any like significant threat outside of that. But I think it's still holding in a really decent position even despite everything that's been going through. Fire Mage, whoever played Fire Mage before had a really good win rate at the start of the season and has just fallen off since then. And it's probably because every single class that's gotten buffed hard counters you, and you haven't really gotten much to compensate. Although I have seen the occasional Fire Mage in Shuffle that feels like, hey, this could be pretty decent. I'm probably going to do my next 2400 challenge on Fire. even given how its outlook for it right now looks like it's pretty weak. I'm going to give it a go because I think it could actually have some potential. Devastation, this is remarkable to see it this low because I feel like Devastation is absolutely cranking, but still only a 3% representation, over a 50% win rate, still really solid specialization to go after. Arcane seems really rough. It just, you're a caster that has to cast in a world where a lot of other casters don't, and that makes it a lot easier to predict your damage, shut down your damage, and you're just a lot less relevant. Your damage output doesn't compensate, right? You're not doing more damage than the instant cast casters while having the liability of having to cast, which is the biggest problem for you specifically, which is why I think it's continuing to trend at the lower end. Augmentation Evoker, same type of deal. Feels like they just wanted to try and strip Augmentation Evoker out of the game after the overwhelming feedback towards it was negative. And maybe it's just still lingering from that. It's a tough spec because it basically works at like a tank spec. It just provides a lot of survivability to your team and then buffs up their damage a bit. So it's functionally a tank spec, although it's listed as a DPS spec. That's why I think most PvP players didn't like its gameplay, especially in Arena specifically, but it's still just not really getting the attention that it would need to really be competitive. And now we're finally getting into Frost. Frost is not surprising to see it trend downward, but I think it's still really good. It's still very, very good. Windwalker trending down a little bit as well. It might be because Ellie and Hunters are getting better. Mages are still decently represented with Frost, and those are just really difficult to fight against, although maybe I overranked Windwalker in some of my earlier assessments as well, but it still seems to be like a really decent specialization. Survivability, or Survival Hunter, same deal, just decently overall specialization. Feral Druid has gone down about 1.1%, but I think it's still actually the best melee in the game, which is why we see the Shadow Priest and the Feral numbers start dropping off so much, but I swear Feral Druid and Shadow Priest are still absolutely bonkers in the current meta. So I wonder how much of this is just Fodom meta chasing sweats or not. But they are still really good even despite those changes. Affliction Warlock as well. It's still really strong. Unholy DK though is the spec that we're seeing now fall below a 50% win rate. And that's when you know your spec's in trouble, is when you're going below 50%. It just needs more single target damage. And the thing is like if they nerfed its dot damage in Battleground Blitz, that's great. But the single target damage, which wouldn't really impact their Battleground Blitz representation, it's just not high enough. Needs a little bit more single target. Marksman Hunter is probably suffering the most, I think, of any specialization in the game. You can see the representation change dropped from 10% to 1%. Marksman Hunter has dropped 8.545% in terms of representation. It needs help, bro. It needs help. Marksman Hunter, I don't know. They removal of the aim shot rapid fire increase on the hero talent tree for Dark Ranger, like that either needs to be baked into the class baseline so you can play both hero talent trees or something, because Marksman Hunter is suffering and Holy Death Knight is definitely suffering. Frost DK is definitely suffering, and that's kind of like the outlook for the DPS specs specifically. When we look at the healers, I think what's interesting about this one is that Disc Priests have definitely started to take off a lot more. With the buffs that they got specifically, and Paladin has fallen off a lot, and Mistweaver is actually starting to trend more in an overall direction that I think is actually where it deserves to be in terms of its power at the moment, because it's really good. Mistweaver is really good. So this is actually moving in the direction that I would have anticipated. Shaman went up a bit since the changes, but it's still pretty weak. I think the Farseer talent tree still needs a lot of assistance, and that's a hero talent tree that's weaker in PvE and PvP, so I feel like that is something that could likely be looked at, although representation in the MDI, which I pay attention to try and anticipate class changes that might come in tomorrow. If you want to make sure you're staying up to date with this change, make sure to smash the subscribe button. But Shaman is kind of, actually I think it was falling off and Disc Priest is taking over, so it is possible Disc Priest actually gets some nerfs, but Shaman might get buffs on Farseer because I think almost everybody's playing Totemic. Resto Druid representation went up a little bit, but it still seems like a bit of a struggle. And surprisingly, Preservation Evoker just continues to trend downward. Preservation Evoker is like one of the most down bad, I would say here. It's like it's literally in Holy Priest territory, which is so surprising because I don't feel like Preservation Evoker is even close to where Holy Priest is in terms of power. Like Holy Priest is at 5.73 and Prez is at 5.87. I would have expected Holy Priest to be way lower than every other healer at the moment. So maybe Holy Priest is only like a couple of tweaks away from being a bit more competitively viable, but it still kind of feels like Paladin and Priest are overtaking the meta, with possibly Mistweaver mixing up like that top three as far as healers for solo shuffle. But the other healers are Preservation Evokers. Just seems remarkable to me that it's fallen so much since the beginning, but it's actually funny to see these healers be so much higher than everybody else. And I think healer balance is actually the most important because there's such a limited amount of specializations available to it. So if you take one of them and it's not viable compared to the rest, you've just lost a huge chunk of potential players, and it means longer queue times. So to me, the most urgent thing to do is to make sure that healers that are weak are getting buffed to be stronger, because that's what makes the queue times faster. We need, like, if any of these healers feel just awful, like Farseer, Resto Shaman feels so rough to heal shuffle, Resto Druid's so rough, Holy Priest is so hard to heal shuffle, those numbers got to go up, because that's going to help the queue times. That's going to just make the health of the game a lot better. So this is honestly the most important thing. I know a lot of people don't really care because maybe they don't play a healer, but like this data is actually the most important to look at and assess. But other than that, that's kind of my analysis here for this week's update for the meta as far as PvP. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion, and I will see you in the next one.